The Flight In. Introductions. The interior of the Valkyrie transport gunship shook and rattled as it blasted at a respectable velocity over the forest, leaving behind a supersonic boom at its passage, startling birds and other wildlife. One crew door was open, the door chief manning the pintle-mounted heavy bolter, tracking for targets below with image-intensifying lenses in his battle helmet. In truth, if there were anything other than the primitive saurians beneath the canopy to threaten them, then the engines of the Cadian pattern Thunderchild would have propelled them out of range before any meaningful weapons lock could have been achieved. Inside the belly of the gunship, a group of 11 other individuals were sat with weapons stowed on either side of the central crew space before the great sliding crew doors. The roar of the engines and wind billowing in through the open gunnery door meant that any normal conversation was impossible and had to be shouted. The 10 men, wearing the standard deep green flak armour and carapace helmets of Cadian shock troopers, bantered loudly back and forth in the easy and savage manner of comrades that had long served together in a rifle platoon, occasionally dragging the door chief into their discussions to back up a point, or to clarify some telling error in a trooper's tall storytelling. The 11th man wore khaki fatigues and polished black boots that were now stained slightly by dirt from being in the field. Atop his close crew-cut head, he wore the tan-coloured cap of an officer of the line, with the silvered badge of the Imperial Aquila glinting in the light of the setting sun to the west. In the storage racks above his head, there was no rifle stowed, but at his hip there was a well-oiled dark leather holster in which nestled a custom-crafted bolt gun. Traditionally, it was a weapon wielded by the Emperor's chosen, the Astartes. A normal bolt gun would shatter the bones of a regular human if they were foolishly to attempt to fire even one of its large explosive cased shots, let alone the burst of devastating heavy automatic weapons fire that it was renowned for. This particular weapon, however, was much smaller so that it could be carried and operated by a mortal man without the risk of self-harm. If the uniform were not enough of a clue, the war gear of this individual marked him out as not just a line officer, but a veteran platoon commander. The shock troopers had noticed, and every now and then the buzz-cut head of the squad's sergeant turned his way speculatively, idly running a thumb over the activation switch of the sharp-toothed chainsword he had propped up next to him. On the third occasion their eyes met, the Sarge smiled the fearsome, grizzled smile of a snarling bear who had lost more than a tooth in his years. The officer looked back unfazed as the squad's leader got to his feet and, despite the treacherous rocking motion of the gunship at high velocity and the danger of the open crew door to his left, casually crossed the distance, using his chainsword as a crutch in one hand and the other to swing from the overhead leather straps like a seasoned hand on the deck of an old Terran naval vessel. He flung himself confidently into the bucket seat next to the officer. The Sarge was a man in his mid-20s by the look of him, or so the officer thought. Although, in the service of the Emperor's Astra Militarum, a man's life experience could vary wildly from individual to individual. There were fops in the high command who knew less about their trade and the terrors of the uncaring galaxy than a frontline trooper with only 15 years to his name. A single glance confirmed to the officer that this individual fell into the latter's camp. A second glance at his stripes and shoulder guard livery confirmed it. Gunnery Sergeant, Squad 812. His mind darted back to his briefing package and his transfer orders. 812. Combined Special Arms Squadron. One of 3 such units in this particular company. The younger man with the buzz cut stared back at him at close range, enduring the scrutiny, and then seemed to come to a conclusion all of his own.
So, Lieutenant, huh?
He grunted, his breath a solid thing in the officer's nostrils. In response, he didn't bat an eyelid, but nodded evenly.
How many times you been deployed, then?
He asked, leaning back against the gunship's bulkhead, head turned to his new companion, thumb still toying with the switch of the deadly eviscerating sword in his offhand. The lieutenant thought it over. Honestly, at this point I can't remember, he said, then added drolly, I get around a lot, you see. Another grunt.
That's usually either because you're in demand or your superiors are trying to get rid of you,
he said boldly. His fingers tightened on the haft of the sword's pommel until his knuckles were white. It didn't escape the officer's notice how the thumb hovered just over the activation switch.
So, which is it?
He demanded. The officer looked back coolly, outwardly completely at ease as if he were chatting with an old friend, and not the reality of being alone at 500 feet, going Mach 3 with a squad full of armed and trained killers, all of which, he noted, had fallen silent in their banter, and were watching the play between the two men like, or so the officer thought, a pack of watchful wolves.
In my experience, he said, if you're a liability, the enemy deals with you eventually.
That's if the company commissars don't get to you first, of course, he finished matter-of-factly, with dry humour. But his answer seemed to satisfy the younger man, who noticeably stopped playing with the large weapon, and his grip lessened slightly, the colour returning to his strong, calloused hand. For a while there was silence within the cabin, broken only by the howl of the wind and turbine engines.
You'll do, sir,
said the sergeant. The lieutenant smiled.
Thank you, Sergeant.
Another grunt, as the squad leader got to his feet and rejoined his men at the other side of the craft, with the same sure-footedness he had demonstrated upon his approach. The officer breathed a silent internal sigh of relief as the pilot came over the internal vox from the cockpit. Approaching Citadel. Close all hatch doors. Make safe and finish your smokes. We're down and clear in 3. One of the squad, a long-haired man whose hygiene was probably not to the required standard, took one last drag on a chem stick before tossing it out the open crew door, still lit, into the forest below. A second later, the crew chief had stowed the big mounted door gun, and it receded into the hull with a whine of oiled servos, and slapped a glowing green icon as the outer hatch sealed itself, repressurizing the cabin. As one man, the crew chief, the 10 troopers, and the officer clicked in safety harnesses for final rapid drop descent velocity. Within 2 minutes they were down, engines cooling as the rear ramp descended. Grabbing their gear, they marched out into the fading light from the horizon and into the Imperial stronghold on Caradon 3.